Okay, hello everyone. This is Volts for March 5th, 2025. The fate of the EV tax credits. I'm your host, David Roberts. The future of the Biden administration's climate agenda has been the subject of fevered speculation since it became clear that Trump would be president. Hardcore MAGA ideologues and Elon Musk, for some reason, want to get rid of all of it, while many Republicans in Congress would prefer a more surgical approach, i.e., they are loath to give up money that's going to their states. Then again, Congress seems to have been reduced to a peripheral and meaningless onlooker in American public life, so maybe what they think doesn't matter. Maybe DOGE will just press a button and the tax credits will vanish. Like everything these days, it is extremely difficult to predict. Instead of getting overwhelmed by pondering the fate of the entire agenda today, I'm just going to focus on EVs, or more specifically, the tax credits that support EVs. On one hand, the manufacturing tax credits have helped build a ton of EV battery and manufacturing capacity in red states. On the other hand, it has practically become conventional wisdom that the consumer EV tax credit is doomed. My guest today disagrees with that prediction. He certainly disagrees with the prescription. Albert Gore leads the Zero Emission Transportation Association, a trade group representing companies up and down the EV supply chain. Naturally, he has many thoughts on these matters. We're going to talk all about the credits, their history, the effects they've had so far, the amount of bipartisan support they maintain, and what might become of them in coming years. So, let's get into it. With no further ado, Albert Gore, welcome to Volts. Thank you so much for coming.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
So, how to approach this? We should just say up front, I mean, I feel like I have to say this now for every pod forever, but like events are moving quickly. Lots of things are happening. Like, for all we know, by the time we're done with this conversation, major government departments could have vanished. So, all of which is to say, we're recording this on February 21st. So, you know, let's hope it holds up for 2 weeks until I can get it out. But just to start with then, Albert, give me a taxonomy of the tax credits involved here. Everybody, I think, when they hear EV support, they hear EV subsidy, they hear EV tax credit, they just think mainly of the $7,500 consumer tax credit that you get when you purchase an eligible EV. But there's kind of a cluster of tax credits. So can we just like figure out what we're talking about here?
Yes, always good to name the credits that we're talk about what they do. And just at the outset, I want to say, I think your summary in broad strokes is representative of a view that a lot of folks have. I would say from my perspective and in my experience, there are many, many caveats to that and a lot of reasons to be hopeful about the reasonableness on the Hill among some folks who, you know, when they're talking about national politics, especially so close to the election, are using this as talking points, but really are trying to be productive in the conversations that we and others are having. So,
sure, we're going to get into all that.
Yeah, we'll get into it. But to go in order of, I think, large to small, the 45X production tax credit is designed to bring advanced manufacturing investment into the United States. It's not specific to EVs or batteries. It also includes solar and wind energy components.
Am I correct that the bulk of the result thus far is EV and battery manufacturing capacity? Like, is that the bulk of sort of what's been announced in the wake of 45X, or am I making that up?
That's correct. And I think part of that was, you know, an existing wave of investment, a smaller wave, you know, spurred on by real movement on EV deployment in the United States between 2015 or so and 2020.
Right.
So coinciding with the launch of the Model 3, the Model Y, I mean, these were produced and sold in volumes that were really kind of game changing. not just for Tesla, but also for the other companies that were seeking to compete, and kind of had one foot in, 1 foot out, but we're saying, okay, we need to dramatically increase our production capacity. We've now seen proven demand for EVs beyond early adopters and folks who are trying to reduce their carbon footprint.
So 45X is the big one.
It's the big one. And for batteries in particular, I think incentivized a number of companies, LG, Samsung, Panasonic, SK, to form joint ventures with automakers or form their own battery manufacturing facilities and increase the size of the investment and the speed with which they were seeking to bring these projects online. Because 45X, the value of it is really targeted at closing the gap between the cost to manufacture a battery in the United States versus manufacturing a battery in China. And the cost to produce things in China doesn't always reflect the price of the products when they enter the market. A lot of times they're sold below the cost to produce them. It's a very difficult challenge, but nonetheless, $35 a kilowatt hour really goes a long way towards closing that gap. And also for folks who have been tracking this, I'm sure you have for a long time, getting closer to price parity for a comparable EV on a price per kilowatt hour basis for, over 300 miles of range with a comparable ICE vehicle. So a big deal, and incented new investments in the United States, but also enhanced and pulled forward and made bigger a lot of investments that were sort of already in the planning stage. So a huge deal. And you mentioned they are, disproportionately located in red districts, and that's true. I tend to think of it, more in terms of they're disproportionately located in places that have a really long history of manufacturing, and a lot of blue collar families who are excited about that investment, regardless of where they sit on the district line, excited about the economic opportunity created by a big new, $7.5 billion joint venture battery and EV plant.
Well, I mean, not to rehearse all this history again, but that was sort of by design. I mean, it's not a coincidence that those places are red. It's almost like describing the same thing in different terms. Like, these are places that used to have manufacturing.
Right.
They're hollowed out, hollowed out by globalization, et cetera, thus the sort of reactionary turn in American politics. And the whole kind of theory of the case was you got to revive those areas, flood investment into those areas. And the idea is that it would change politics, which, maybe someday it will, but it doesn't seem
100%, But the actual tax credit itself has no bearing on where a company locates other than just in the United States. States like Tennessee, Georgia, Kentucky, Ohio, Michigan, the Carolinas, they have really amazing economic development teams that go around the world to pitch specific sites in their states. This is a mega site for a battery facility, a vehicle assembly plant. And so it enhanced that proposition. There are some areas particularly in the battery and the mineral supply chain and, everything adjacent to EV assembly, where there is a bit of a zero-sum game between resources and talent and IP and investment going into the United States or within the community of FTA countries that, the U.S. sphere of influence, or going to China or to countries that are being invested in or being served by China with their growing demand for batteries and EVs. It's a bit of an oversimplification, but not really, because there are some statistics that are pretty staggering that I think we can highlight later. But the degree to which the Chinese auto market has really exploded over the last 25 years, it's gone from 0% to 40% of global automotive sales. And a lot of those are EVs. Their capacity to manufacture batteries. We saw this in the solar industry too, 15 years ago, and to the detriment of some domestic solar manufacturers flooding the market with cheap solar panels. Mm-hmm. It was not great for investing in that type of manufacturing in the United States, but it did seed the world with a ton of low-cost panels. So what we're doing with EVs now is very, very different than that. And by the way, there is now a really thriving domestic American solar manufacturing industry.
I mean, the whole proposition was, let's not let the same thing happen to EVs that happened with solar panels. I mean, that was kind of like from the clean energy people, that was sort of the premise of the whole thing. Like, we don't want to just enjoy the cheap outcomes. We want to be involved in the plating. Okay, so 45X is a big one, but let's get through them.
Yeah, we'll go on. So the next biggest is the 30D consumer tax credit. So the new clean vehicle tax credit. So this is the one that is $7,500, but with a bunch of caveats.
Mm-hmm.
And, you mentioned the discussion about, how to handle this relative to solar. So the original 30D credit, or the previous version of it, had a 200,000 unit per manufacturer cap.
Yeah, can we talk about the history real quick? Because this one, in some form, has been around for several years, right? Like, what's the origin? Do you know where it first cropped up?
I believe it came about after the financial crisis. I kind of want to double check that. But, back before really anybody was making EVs in the United States or selling EVs in the United States, but go back 15 years, you had the Nissan Leaf, you had the Chevy Volt, and then the Bolt. And, some of those vehicles were sort of designed to capture the credit, with, in terms of because it was tied to battery capacity. I won't malign the Leaf in that way. Tennessee EV, by the way. I'm always happy to see those on the road. But really, Tesla in 2012 with the Model S started to produce, higher volumes.
Sure. Well, Tesla famously, like, that tax credit was the bulk of their income for the first many years of Tesla's life.
Well, there were the regulatory credits as well from the performance standards.
Oh, right. Yes. Right. My mistake. Yes.
Yeah.
That's true.
Which would fit that description better.
Yes.
But, but those, that's an important policy. It did work as intended to, people are skeptical of those type of market-based mechanisms, but in general, they work to a certain extent.
Yeah, I want to discuss the caveats later and the real effect of it, but let's get through the credits. There's one on leasing. Is that a separate?
Yeah, so the 45W commercial clean vehicle credit is similar to 30D in terms of the value for light-duty vehicles at $7,500. It also, it's intended to apply to any commercial vehicle, so all the way from ride-sharing fleets and rental car fleets up to medium-duty last-mile delivery and Class 8. They're really effective, does not contain the sourcing requirements, the mineral content, the foreign entity of concern. 30D has income requirements, MSRP caps, all kinds of sourcing.
Yeah.
It's the most stringent credit on like 5 different, the most stringent and the most vulnerable for some reason. But
it's the one that has "Mansion was here" spray painted on it.
Correct. And it's essentially doing what he wanted it to
do. But wait, so the commercial credit has none of those? It's just any EV?
Correct. And really is intended to incentivize commercial entities putting vehicles to commercial use.
Right. Fleets.
To buy EVs. Yeah. A lot of fleets are light duty vehicles, but also for these delivery vans, last mile delivery and freight. A huge deal. It became the subject of really intense criticism because the way the law is written, for a consumer who leases a vehicle, the taxpayer who buys the vehicle from the OEM is the leasing trust, and they thus are eligible for the credit because they are putting the vehicle to commercial use by leasing it out to customers.
Oh, is that where the leasing thing comes from? It's in the commercial vehicle credit?
Correct.
This is why everybody's leasing vehicles now instead of buying them, because you can still get the credit through a lease that you can't get buying it.
That's right. If you don't qualify for 30D, either as a taxpayer or because the vehicle isn't totally compliant, then you can lease. So I think that's pretty vulnerable. Senator Manchin certainly didn't like that interpretation, but
yeah, can we? I don't want to do a rabbit hole on this, but quickly, like, Manchin says this was a deliberate attempt to get around the restrictions in the consumer tax credit. Do you think it was? Like, do you think that the people who designed this knew what they were doing and knew that leasing would be this kind of loophole that would let a lot of cars through?
What I'll say is, if you ask, the authors of the bill, they will say it's being implemented as intended, as drafted. I also think that the bill text, now law text doesn't really allow for any other interpretation. If I lease a car, I don't own it.
Right.
The owner is the commercial entity that is leasing it to me, which is a commercial use.
So you got the manufacturing, consumer purchase, commercial purchase. And is there one related to used EVs? Is that a separate?
That is a separate, yeah. That's the 25E credit. And that has even lower income requirements than 30D
right.
and a much lower MSRP cap. I think the MSRP is 25K on that one. So it's a great credit for expanding access, and particularly with a lot of used EVs coming into the marketplace, and really is only available to people who, I think it's under 75K a year in income. Still going to be vulnerable, but that's what that credit is. It can only be taken once per vehicle.
Oh, interesting.
But it's a good credit.
Yeah. Am I hallucinating, or is there one on chargers specifically, on EV chargers?
Yeah, that's the alternative fuel vehicle refueling property credit. We just call it the charging credit. It's 30C. Also a really important credit for lowering the upfront costs to install chargers, and the stakeholders for that credit are pretty widespread in terms of municipalities and places that really are excited to get new charging installed, particularly charging that isn't going to be really highly utilized right away. That's the most difficult economic case, is accounting for the time between when you install a charger, particularly like a fast charger, and when you reach high enough utilization that you're recovering all of your fixed costs.
Yeah, I mean, that's a dilemma facing every single charger, right? I mean, that's sort of the entire industry is kind of in that weird lacuna state right now.
That's right, because, the utility needs to be able to deliver 150 or 250 or 350 kilowatts to each of those posts whenever it's demanded. So there's a cost to that. And if it's not being utilized, you're not really absorbing any of that cost. So you can build a bunch of level 2 chargers and leave them sitting there, and it's not going to cost you a whole lot. But level 3 chargers need to be utilized. And so taking a little bit out of the upfront costs goes a long way to get more of those chargers in the ground in places where they're needed.
All right. So we got manufacturing, consumer purchase, commercial purchase, used EVs, and chargers. That's 5. Is that all the EV-related tax credits, to your knowledge?
Almost. There's one more that is less well-known, less publicized, but the Qualifying Advanced Energy Project Credit, 48C, is an investment tax credit, and it is an important part of our industry. I don't think it's on the chopping block in the same way that some of the others are, because again, it's an investment tax credit. But we'll add that to the list. These are those are the credits we really work on.
Okay, so let's then talk about which out of those, there's so much chaos going on. There's so many people saying things. So let's try to just kind of review.
It's an understatement.
What are the concrete threats here? Which ones of these has someone in a specific position of power said something specific about? Which ones of these are you worried about politically? All of them? Are there one or two? Or do we even know enough to know that much yet? Sort of what's your threat assessment here?
Yeah. Well, it would be naive to say that, I'm not worried about any one particular credit, because I think each of these credits has merits and they make a lot of sense. I think I've recited your summary of the history of policy from the BTU tax to the cap and trade to the carbon tax. And here's why the IRA exists.
Yeah.
I loved it. Actually, I got to tell you, there was one time I was mid spiel and somebody goes, "I think I listened to this David Roberts podcast." And I was like, "Oh man, you caught me." I was like, "Yep, nope, that's the one."
Yeah, all the policy logic for why IRA was a desirable thing. I mean, despite the chaos and insanity of our times, all that logic is still there. It all still makes sense. You know what I mean? It's all still chugging along in the background.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the cap and trade was designed around reducing emissions, and Build Back Better was designed around getting as many EVs on the road as possible. I think industrial policy, which I reframe as federal investments in the industrial sector, there's broad agreement that the United States as a country needs to think about big issues of national importance, such as looking at what's happening in the world. Can the United States remain not just a global competitor, but a global leader in manufacturing of advanced technology? And we certainly can, from an R&D perspective, from an entrepreneurial perspective. And the United States has a lot going for it. We have great capital markets. We have great education system. A lot of people come here to start companies and succeed. So federal investments in things like battery manufacturing, mineral production, refining, battery component manufacturing, and vehicle manufacturing, those are non-controversial.
Yeah, no one's arguing
usually.
No one's arguing against any of this currently based on the old conservatism, the old small government libertarian conservatism. Like, I don't really hear those arguments against IRA insofar as you hear any arguments against it.
I think the libertarian perspective on industrial policy is complicated. I think, and there are a lot of really smart folks that I like to read, like some folks at Cato that have, I think, good criticisms of how to make these things better, more effective. So it's not a pure conservative idea to do this, but it is a sort of, it's an approach that I think works when you're connecting it to things of national importance that people really do agree about. And also you can connect it down to the local level, whether it's in a red district or a blue district. Towns like Savannah, I was in Savannah this week, or, the area around Phoenix, Memphis, or Chattanooga. These are places that they need investment. They have the workforce, and it's a worthy federal investment to say, we're going to, as a country, decide to make this sector as competitive as possible with our chief global competitor in this arena, which is not operating on a market-based system, is setting global commodity prices in the global commodity market, but oftentimes below the cost to produce the commodities. And that significantly negatively impacts the ability to finance projects outside of China's sphere of influence. So there's broad agreement about the need to do something about that. To get back to 30D really quickly, I don't know if I even mentioned 30D at the start of this, but you asked, what's the most controversial credit?
Right, 30D is the consumer
It
one.
is, yeah, sorry.
And as far as I know, is that the only one that Trump and his people have specifically called out as targeting, or have they explicitly said anything about the others? Like, do we have a handle on which of all these credits we discussed they're actually going after?
Well, I would say that from the administration, and even going back to the campaign, it wasn't really that specific on tax credits. I think
it really wasn't.
Things were generally sort of lumped together, and the vast majority of, I think, the political weight associated with EVs was the regulation. So the new light duty
from EPA
emission standards, the heavy duty standards, the CAFE rule, and the ACC2 waiver, or in general, California's waiver to set its own air quality standards. So the rulemaking period for the EPA rule on light duty was long. It's like 11 months between 2023 and early 2024. And it created a real intense battleground around, legacy OEMs, EV OEMs, oil and gas industry. And it was right as the presidential campaign was taking off. So there hasn't been like a zeroing in on any one credit.
Although I have heard Mike Johnson say, these are, he is lumping them all together, but he's saying these are wasteful, these wasteful clean energy credits are just wasting money and raising costs. So he at least is saying things that make it sound like he wants to go after all of them.
For sure, at the congressional level, there's more specificity around.
Yeah. This brings me to my next question, which I think is particularly salient these days, which is how would you revoke these credits if you wanted to? Am I right in saying that in a sane, normal constitutional world, Congress has to do this, right? Congress has to pass a new law saying the credits we passed, we're unpassing them. That is, as far as we know, what has to happen to get rid of these. Is that right? Like Trump can't just kill them. I mean, legally. he's killing lots of stuff illegally, but he can't legally just kill them. Is that right?
Well, it depends on the credit, but we could get in detail on what the executive branch could do to effectively neuter the 30D or the 45W credit.
Oh, even if it's on the books, you think they can still screw it up?
I think 45W would be a bit harder because of the bill text, but 30D, so the new clean vehicle credit, the $7,500 credit, went through a very long implementation process, and it was actually incredibly well done, I think, and very stringent, but a lot of interpretation between, Treasury and DOE with regard to how do you define eligible, critical minerals or qualifying critical minerals, and where do you draw the line in a process that starts at, rocks coming out of the ground, getting sort of processed into powder and going through a lot of different chemical processes. And at some point, there's a slurry that's sprayed onto a wafer and the wafers get stacked. And then it, eventually becomes a battery cell. But the way the law was written, it had battery components and critical minerals, which are subject to different requirements. And there was a new category of constituent materials that's not in the law, but it made sense for the implementation. So there's a way for the administration to go in and mess around with that stuff through rulemaking. But I don't think that is likely. I mean, for one reason, I think we're looking right now at, sort of an unfolding jurisdictional fight between the House and the Senate as to who is going to, have the pen to move these priorities forward. So you have, Senate budget resolution, House budget resolution. Tax policy has to originate in the House in Ways and Means. And the Ways and Means Committee and several other committees going back to middle of last year, they were already soliciting input and trying to draft a tax reform bill. I mean, they've been thinking about this for a long time.
Well, it's the one thing they reliably do when they are elected is cut taxes for rich people. All the other things they say, you never know whether it'll happen or not, but that is definitely going to happen.
Well, and, this tax bill in particular is a big one.
And we should say, just for context, they've made a lot of promises about cutting a lot of spending. And anyone who knows the federal budget very well knows that there just aren't a lot of places to find spending to cut. It's certainly not popular places. So they're looking everywhere to cut spending. So that is a lot of the sort of context and talk around this is like, where can we cut? Oh, look, here's a bunch of subsidies to clean energy. We can cut those. Yeah. They wouldn't, we should say, save all that much money in the grand scheme of things.
But, this gets into the minutia of like House rules versus Senate rules. But there is a rule in the House under the Republican majority that, no bill should be introduced that has new spending that isn't offset. And so from that perspective, Ways and Means doesn't want to introduce a tax reform bill that doesn't have all of the new spending offset. It remains to be seen how much of a guiding force that's going to be for folks in the Senate and in the White House who I think want to make sure they move this tax reform bill forward because the House has a very slim majority. And because of the impact of industrial policy, I'd say particularly in our industry, even though we're in the crosshairs, but across multiple different clean energy technologies and other, there's tech neutral credits, like they're having a big impact and people really believe in them. And then beyond that, from the business community, the message has been, we as a group just committed, hundreds of billions of dollars in investment in the United States in reliance on this policy. So please don't just repeal the entire thing. You've seen a lot of statements to that effect. So, and this is what I was referring to in my my first statement about, the intro, I think there are a lot of folks on the Hill that certainly get that.
Well, I want to hear your argument. I mean, this is, I think, kind of the core argument of this pod. The whole kind of point of this is I think what's happening in DC, with all the usual caveats, is I think a lot of people on the right are thinking, we got to cut something. The manufacturing tax credit is sending money straight to red states. So we'll just cancel the consumer one because that looks like it's just hitting a bunch of upscale libs who buy EVs, right? So, but your argument is that the consumer tax credit and the manufacturing tax credit are connected, and the consumer tax credit is driving investment in manufacturing capacity. It's not just, it has industrial policy implications beyond just, giving money to wealthy people. So to lay out that argument, because I'm sure this is what you're saying to Congress people when you talk to them.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. I mean, I think there's an understanding of the consumer credit that's a bit outdated. It's sort of rooted in this pre-2022 world where any EV qualifies for the $7,500 tax credit. It was capped. So Tesla and GM hadn't taken any credit since 2018 because that's when they hit the cap. But, the initial proposal in Build Back Better was just to restore that without a cap, to turn over the vehicle fleet as quickly as possible. That has coincided with just this enormous growth in the Chinese vehicle market, the Chinese battery market. So Senator Manchin, as you mentioned, in the interregnum where the IRA looked like it was dead, but really it was being fine-tuned into this China competition, U.S. onshoring bill that it became. And 30D is the most fine-tuned example of that. So Senator Manchin took a credit that would apply to any EV and basically said, this is only going to apply to EVs made in North America. So vehicle assembly has to be in North America. And in practice right now, that's almost entirely the US. There are a few EVs made in Mexico. But beyond that, we're going to put an income limit on who can take the credit. So if you're making, I think it's more than $140,000 a year.
Household, not just individual household.
No, that's individual.
Is it?
Yeah. So sorry, it's $150K for individual filers, $225 for heads of households, and $300 for married couples filing jointly.
Got it.
We're going to put MSRP caps on $55K for sedans, $80K for SUVs, and then escalating requirements for critical mineral and battery component by value in the vehicle battery. So that started at 40% of the critical minerals by value needed to come from the US or an FTA country, and 50% of the battery components needed to be assembled in North America, manufactured or assembled in North America.
Cumulatively, those are incredibly tight requirements, which had the effect of excluding most of the, most people in most EVs. It ended up narrowing the thing considerably.
It narrowed it quite a bit. I mean, no foreign-made EV qualified and no sedan over 55K qualified, and frankly, SUVs over 80K, which, at the time, there were just a few. Now there are more coming into the market that qualify. But, the idea that this is still just subsidizing purchases for rich people is false. It's outdated. But what's been most important is these critical mineral and battery component requirements, because they start at 40 and 50%, but they go up to 80 and 100% in fairly short order. I'm talking 7-8 years. So what that did is created a huge motivation and wave of investment by automakers in moving supply chains and developing new supply chains, either in the US or within FTA countries for critical minerals. And in order to continue to meet those escalating requirements. So every year it goes up 10% till it gets to 100% of battery components and 80% of critical minerals. The other thing, and this is the major hammer that comes in, is in January of 2024, the foreign entity of concern rule went into effect for battery components. So no battery component could have been manufactured or assembled by a foreign entity of concern. So no Chinese company, either in China or abroad, could manufacture a component for an eligible vehicle. it disqualifies the whole vehicle if there's any ineligible component.
Mm-hmm.
And in 2025, so just last month, the same rule for critical minerals went into effect. So no mineral extracted or processed by a foreign entity of concern in China or abroad, it would take a long time, but they created very, very thorough and strict definitions of, what happens if it's a JV, what happens if there's a licensing agreement. They really took their time, thought it through, and made it work. I mean, the intent was for none of this revenue to go towards helping China build up its dominance over this part of the upstream supply chain.
The way to look at it then is if 45X was a subsidy of manufacturing supply, 30D is meant to create a demand pull
exactly
for that same manufacturing. And both those are required to pull the manufacturing in here.
That's exactly right. And, people ask me all the time, what's going to be the impact of the repeal of 30D if it's repealed?
Indeed, I was just about to ask you that.
Yeah. So in general, the question is, what's going to be the impact of that on EV deployment in the U.S.? And there are estimates around that, 30% decline, et cetera.
25-30% decline in EV sales in the U.S. is what one big study found.
Correct. And that matters a lot to me. It doesn't matter a lot to folks that, I'm really trying to convince of the merit of this credit. But what the real story is here is the main impact of 30D repeal is not to, vehicle OEMs or consumers, although it is going to put upward pressure on prices for EVs, to consumers. The real impact, the biggest impact, is on the mining sector and the battery component sector in the U.S. and among the trusted, trade allies of the U.S. that are all working together to try to catch up to China, which has spent 15 years doing its own type of policy, which is, very different, but certainly has the demand pull. And so for companies that are in the lithium space, in the cobalt space in the U.S. does have domestic cobalt production that's actually being done responsibly, but is now shut down because the price of cobalt is sort of artificially suppressed below the price that would actually support operation of that facility in Idaho. And we see this with lithium projects as well. Really solid. These aren't the old, the mining projects from 50 years ago. These are really, established companies trying to do it the right way and trying to serve U.S. demand for these minerals.
And we should say that starting a mine is not it's not even like building a factory. It's a long-term, capital-intensive kind of thing that you're only going to do if you feel very confident about the demand on the other side.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. You can have the best resource in the world. It's still going to take a massive amount of upfront capital investment, finance. So you've got, your financing costs that you carry for, through the permitting process, through the NEPA process, maybe 5 years, 7 years through a litigation process.
Yeah, what do they say? The average is 10 to 13 years or something to get to mine up and running, which we could talk about how helpful is that even going to be to the U.S.? I mean, trying to start mines quickly is a maddening.
There's some things that I think we can do to improve that process as well, and also restore the trust in the regulatory process and social license and all that. But when you are investing on an estimated commodity price for, let's say, lithium, the global lithium market is, it's a commodity market, but it's a highly illiquid market. And China produces a lot of lithium and more importantly, refines a lot of lithium. 3/4 of the lithium in the world comes out of Australia and the Atacama Desert area, Bolivia, Argentina, and Chile. But, the majority of it is refined and processed into battery-grade lithium in China.
It's in the high 90%. It's 98% or something absurd like that.
For lithium, it's a little less than that. For graphite, it is.
Oh, yeah, it's graphite I'm thinking of.
Nearly 100%. But so how do we solve that problem in the U.S.? Actually, the new consumer or the new clean vehicle credit is the most effective policy we've ever had. at attacking that problem, because domestic producers, and this extends down the supply chain, have offtake agreements based on the value of the credit with automakers. You have GM invested $650 million directly in Lithium Americas Thacker Pass project. Albemarle has offtake agreements with many different automakers. Ioneer has a joint venture with Ford for refining. The LPO has been very active in this space as well. It's a whole other topic, is the importance of honoring those commitments from LPO.
Yeah.
But that is contingent on this demand signal that is telling these companies that have resources and the ability to deliver, basically the engine of the clean energy economy. We want it to be here.
I want to talk about sort of like, what is the disposition of Congress on this, which might be sort of different than what people say for the microphones. I wonder, do you think that this connection between the consumer credit spurring manufacturing investment, this idea that sort of like the manufacturing tax credit and the consumer tax credit are of a piece, are an ecosystem, both of which are required to spur the manufacturing, do you feel like that's well understood in Congress? What's your read on, I mean, trying to predict anything is a fool's game these days, but like, what's your read on Congress's disposition on this? Is there enough undercover support, undercover understanding of this that you think it's going to survive? What's your take on Congress right now? Hey there, everybody. Don't worry, I'm not going to tell you about a new mattress or push a credit card on you. This isn't an ad. There are no ads on Volts. It is supported entirely by listeners like you. If you'll indulge me for a second, I'd like to ask for your support. I started Volts because we're all surrounded by depressing news about climate change and misinformation about clean energy, and it's never been more important to share the stories of the real people on the ground doing the real work of transition, and all the ingenuity and courage and public spirit they are bringing to it. People are hungry to hear these stories, to learn from and find inspiration in them. I've heard from people who change majors or careers after hearing episodes of Volts, people using it in classrooms and community groups, even state legislators who have passed bills inspired by specific episodes. Sharing these stories matters. It makes a difference. If you have found value in it and want to help me continue doing it, I hope you will join the community of paid subscribers at volts.wtf. It's about the cost of a cup of coffee a month. If you don't like subscriptions, you can make a one-time contribution, leave a review on Apple or Spotify, or just tell a friend about Volts. I am grateful for any and all support. If you're already a paid subscriber, thank you. And now, back to the show. Trying to predict anything is a fool's game these days, but like, what's your read on Congress's disposition on this? Is there enough undercover support, undercover understanding of this that you think it's going to survive? What's your take on Congress right now?
Well, the short answer is no. I don't think that it's well understood, but I do know that there are many people who do understand it. This is where, the 30D credit in particular suffers from the just baked in political weight of the campaign and the conflation of any EV policy with the EPA rules. The message is like, the government shouldn't tell me what car to buy.
Yeah.
They're going to take away your gas cars. I mean, that has absolutely nothing to do with the 30D credit, but it's an easy talking point. And what we're seeking to do is just bring it back down to the local level. So instead of talking about it conceptually, which is important, showing people the economic impact, not just in making cars, but making every part of the supply chain. So we've been trying to host, business roundtables. We did one in Phoenix, in the Phoenix area last year. We had a bunch of folks get on an electric school bus, drive 60 miles outside of Phoenix to the Lucid factory, took a tour there, went to a copper mine next door. We had a series of discussions at Salt River Project's headquarters there in Tempe, where, we're talking about grid issues. We're talking about the sort of standalone battery manufacturers that are in the region as well, but trying to make it as clear as we can to folks. If you think about an EV, think about all these jobs in Arizona. And, we were in Savannah this week with Congressman Buddy Carter, who I think understands these issues about as well as anybody in the Republican caucus. Hyundai's in his district. LG has joint venture there. There's a really thriving domestic solar manufacturing industry in Georgia. And you don't have to go far. You go up to North Carolina, and there's a huge lithium asset there that Albemarle is developing. You've got in Chattanooga, you've got domestic synthetic graphite made by Novonix.
Right.
They've got offtake agreements with every automaker. And, you've got SK making batteries in Commerce, Georgia, going to Chattanooga, put into VW ID Force, and, showing the value chain and the jobs and the economic impact represented across all these small towns. Commerce, Georgia is not a big town.
Yeah.
And Savannah is not a huge city, but $7.5 billion invested in EV and battery manufacturing there. That's a huge deal for that community. And Congressman Carter made this point very well. It's not just $7.5 billion; it's that much or more in indirect economic impact, because you got to have all of these things, housing and every service that a community needs that provides jobs. So connecting that in as many towns as we can across the country where our companies have a footprint, Ohio, Michigan, Tennessee.
I don't know if this would be any use in an argument with a congressperson because it's a little bit more abstract, but also there's just like the U.S. promised you X amount of money. You came in and invested several $100 million or $1 billion. And now in the midst of your investment, we're going to yank it away. There's just like at a certain point, the trust, you know what I mean? Like capitalism relies on trust in a lot of ways, like just viewing the U.S. government as a stable partner, viewing the U.S. as a stable investment. You're going to lose all that eventually if you keep offering things and yanking them away and proving yourself so inconstant. Like that has ambient effects on people's willingness to invest in your country over time.
That's right. And I think there are a lot of people that get that. The pressure to cut things, and this isn't specific to EVs, but it has a specific, flavor when we're talking about EVs. It's a real thing. There are deficit hawks. There are folks that are genuinely concerned about the debt and see this as an opportunity to do something about it. So, the analogy would be, if you're running a company and, your choice is bankruptcy or cutting a significant amount of your cost structure, you have to cut things that are good and you wouldn't otherwise cut, but you feel an obligation to do it as, in your fiduciary duty, your management duty. So I think there are folks that are really coming to it from that perspective.
And also, can I just throw this in there too? Because this is like a hobby point for me. Like one of the premises of sort of right-wing economics, conservative economics, is that tax cuts pay for themselves, right? The idea is like you cut taxes on someone, they become more productive, they make more stuff, they therefore generate more tax revenue than they otherwise would have, and you end up with more money than you started with. Why wouldn't that exact same logic apply to tax subsidies like this? They pay for themselves. You're subsidizing a factory, but then the factory is up and running and all the jobs and indirect jobs and all that tax revenue is going to amount to more than you paid for the subsidy. Like it's the same logic on the other side. I don't know why they treat them differently.
That's where it really does have to do with EVs and the politics around them. I mean, you could call them tax subsidies or call them federal investments in the tax code, all across other industries that have been there for 50 years or more. And they're so baked in that you can't even really find them all and aggregate. People do studies on this, particularly in the fossil fuel industry.
At a certain point when a subsidy has been around long enough, you sort of stop calling it a subsidy, right? I mean, it becomes like architecture. It becomes infrastructure.
It's just there, but it lowers the cost of an industry to do business, which produces more jobs and more revenue and all that. So this is a new one.
Yeah.
But I like to talk about it in terms of, what's a worthy federal investment? A federal investment in a community that has a multiplier effect and creates benefits far beyond just the value of the federal investment. That's a good investment, particularly in this industry.
Another question about whether this is a good investment or not. Like to me, it seems sort of dead obvious that EVs are going to triumph in the long term. Like that just, I hardly see an argument around that. It's just, we're just arguing about the time horizon, right? But, I take that for granted. Do members of Congress take that for granted? Like you hear, like they used to talk about reviving coal, which was ludicrous. Like, do they understand that this is in some sense an inevitability and that you got to get on this train at some point? Or do they really think that this is a fad that they can sort of head off? Do you have a good sense of that?
Well, I think there are other stakeholders that certainly make that case that, EVs are going to go away. But the industry estimates, Cox Automotive has no agenda when they estimate that, 80% of people will be considering EV by beginning of the next decade. I think that's more rooted in like looking at EVs just as another car. So if you have a comparable EV and a comparable ICE vehicle, what do they estimate the rate is of people that will choose the EV? So, and you can look at other countries that don't have the same type of politics, don't have the same domestic, energy production politics around oil and gas and all that stuff. EVs are viewed far more as just cars in the market. But I do think that, there is a disconnect between what's actually happening with EV adoption in the United States and the understanding that folks that represent communities that don't have significant deployment of EVs, and they really haven't seen it. There's a social proof effect.
For sure.
See this with rooftop solar as well. I started in the rooftop solar industry. There's no substitute for like your neighbor putting solar panels on their house.
They're contagious.
Yeah, because, it's one thing to talk to a salesman about it or read an advocate telling you why it's good. Just talk to your neighbor and be like, what do I need to worry about here? And then it kind of makes sense. So I think that the story around EVs has gotten lost, a little bit lost. We're doing our best to try to bring it back to the forefront. But, some of the campaign messaging was like, these things are all made in China.
Yes, this was what Mike Johnson said. We're putting money in China's pockets. Like, did you not read the tax credit that your own Congress just passed? It was like a year ago.
74% of EVs sold in the U.S. in 2023 were made in the U.S.
Yeah, people do not get that. I'm about to get an Ioniq 5, which I'm ludicrously excited about, waiting for it to show up at the dealer.
Made in Savannah.
Yeah, it was made in Georgia, I think.
Yeah, I was just at the site where they're making
that's funny.
It's got an LG battery.
Yeah, people do not get that. One other substantive question on policy. It seems certain that EPA is going to go after climate regulations, including mobile source climate regulations. So there's two ways they could do that. One, they could just run a new rulemaking procedure and weaken the fuel economy standards that were just passed last year. Or if they wanted to go big, wanted to go nuclear, they could go after the endangerment finding, which is the premise of all carbon regulations at EPA, which just says, hey, CO2 is a dangerous air pollutant. In terms of effects on the industry, how do you rate that threat relative to the threat to the tax credits? Which of those two policies do you think is driving more actual change?
Well, on the endangerment finding, that was in one of the executive orders. It's certainly a huge concern, but it was settled law at the Supreme Court, Mass versus EPA. I think that would be a much larger fight. The EPA rulemaking, that culminated in 2024 really did take into account a lot of industry feedback, and, the innovators actually, intervened in support of it. And when there were petitions for review filed, so did we. But I think they'll certainly advocate for something that is less stringent. They would say, provides more flexibility and, lets consumers lead the way. That's sort of the message. But I think that there will be a desire to avoid what happened 7 years ago where, EPA rolled things back so farther than the industry wanted that it kind of bifurcated the industry. They went after the waiver, and you had automakers, opting into an agreement with California on air quality standards, even without the waiver, based on the expectation that it would be restored. So I think there's a little bit of fatigue around that. At the end of that 4-year period, legacy automakers had, I think, kind of been in limbo, and Tesla had the whole market to itself almost. And by the end of 2021 was a like $1 trillion company. Because if you're serving a market that industry analysts estimate has significant demand and don't have a lot of competition, you're going to do very well. So I think there's the market pressure underneath all of this.
Yeah.
That if you believe the folks like Cox Automotive and Bloomberg New Energy Finance stuff that estimate based on everything they know about consumers that a lot of people are going to like these cars, whether they're Democrat or Republican or Libertarian, they're just cars and people like them, then you really need to be moving in this direction if you want to compete.
Yeah, this is the other thing. I want to know, because you talk to auto companies, presumably, frequently, and I'm sort of curious whether they buy this argument, which is just that, like, even if the U.S. government takes the pressure off you right now and for the foreseeable future, the market is moving towards EVs. And while you're mucking about, hoovering the last bit of money you can get out of giant gas SUVs, Chinese automakers are establishing dominance in this market. So it's incredibly short-sighted to do this. Like, one way or the other, eventually you're going to have to compete in this market. And the longer you wait to get started on it, the longer of a lead Chinese companies have. It seems like if you're a U.S. automaker, that ought to be compelling to you. But then I'm not a U.S. automaker, so what do I know? Like, do the U.S. automakers understand that?
Absolutely. I think that's driving a lot of investment. And I think EPA's mandate is not to, determine what kind of cars
of course,
people make or drive. EPA's mandate is to look at the current technology, the current trends, and reduce pollution based on what's feasible. And so they created a rule that would have reduced tailpipe pollution. It would have cut it in half by 2032. And, the final rule gave a lot of flexibility with regard to what kind of powertrains, can be used for that. And, plug-in hybrids, a plug-in hybrid that's got 80 or 100 miles of range is very different than one that has 20 miles of range.
Yeah.
And so there will be certainly a role for that. And then you've even got some new technology that has been deployed in China. Now a couple U.S. companies are looking at it with an onboard range extending generator.
Yeah, those are intriguing. I can't decide where I come down on that. I mean, like, just based on first principles, you have to believe that, like, a car with two separate propulsion systems is not going to win in the end. Like, that's.
I mean, it just has an electric motor. The generator
charges the electric motor.
Correct. So you'd have like 300 miles of range on your battery, and then I think in theory, then the generator can extend that to like 600. I mean, BYD has vehicles like this in China.
Yeah, those seem like a killer app. Why do we not have a single one of those that's available to this market? Like a plug-in hybrid EV that would go 80 to 100 miles on electric and then could switch over to gas is the sweet spot right now for the U.S. market. And it's not here. Like, you can buy one of those in China today and you cannot in the U.S. today. What the hell?
Yeah, and speaking of kind of abandoning, I mean, the U.S. used to export a lot of cars.
Yeah.
GM was the biggest company in the world, middle of last century. And I think as demand for EVs has been proven, we look at places like Central America, Latin America, BYD's got cars for sale for $20,000.
And the 2 and 3 wheelers, 2 and 3 wheelers going electric faster than any other category.
The Chinese share of the EV market in, many of those countries is going to be 90%.
Yeah.
So we need to move quickly. We really need to move in this direction, do everything we can, use every tool in the toolbox, and that includes the federal investments in the tax code, that includes LPO. If it's working, it ought to be retained. I mean, I think that there are a lot of folks on the Hill.
So simple, but so out of step with our times.
I mean, you have to understand the top-down pressure to cut spending and then the political pressure to go after EVs is pretty significant. But there are plenty of folks who understand that and are willing to say, if it's working, we ought to keep it. And so what we're trying to do is just give them the ammo. Say, Here's exactly how it's working. Here's a picture of how it's working. Here's a video. Here are all the people that are working here. And they are really excited about this. And the great thing about the supply chain represented in ZETA is from critical minerals to battery components to recycling to EV OEMs, charging companies, and utilities. The workforce across all of those sectors is 7 million. It's crazy. Across the entire country, that's a built-in constituency that is just all in on this. And when you're talking about investments that benefit the country overall and also are lifelines to these communities that really want the jobs and the economic opportunity, but also are really excited. They have a stake in this project of national importance. Same with the chips manufacturers. I mean, that's a huge deal. There are lots of people that recognize the strategic importance there for the country overall. If you take any political feelings out of it about EVs and folks who just haven't seen a lot of EVs deployed in their community yet, it's a no-brainer for a lot of people to say, yeah, this makes sense.
I mean, find me an EV owner on the planet who would go back to a gas car.
In surveys, 90%. People really like these cars. They're fun to drive. You can plug in anywhere. I still have friends who have not installed level 2 chargers. May come down to my house if they've got to take a road trip. But for their day-to-day commute, they're just recovering, 30, 40 miles.
Yeah, we have a level 2 at our house, but we probably charge our EV once every 2 weeks. Everyone overestimates, how much range they're really going to practically need. So these are a good product. It's popular. It's driving jobs. The policy's working. It's got bipartisan support in a normal, sane and normal political world. That would give us confidence that these credits will survive. I guess the question, which neither of us can answer, is, are we in a normal political world? And just how abnormal is it? I guess we'll find out. One final question I want to ask you before I let you go. If the feds kill this tax credit, we know that some states have EV tax credits. Is there any real prospect that a coalition of states, say the same states that are on California's EPA waiver, which, by the way, is also on the chopping block, but the same states, if they all got together and said, we're going to sort of replicate the federal EV, tax credits, we're going to include our own domestic sourcing requirements, could a coalition of states accomplish anything close to what the national credit is doing? Could they compensate for the loss?
Yeah, it's a really interesting idea. There are a collection of states that have had either, a sales tax exemption or an EV rebate. When you're at the state level, state budgets are, sometimes more challenging. Some states have legislatures that meet every 2 years. I mean, it's difficult to create a funding mechanism that is steady enough.
Yeah.
But I think, the idea to replicate the requirements within 30D is an interesting one. It would stretch the money out a bit longer. I think that states are committed. We call them, Section 177 states that have joined California under that section of the Clean Air Act. But that's about EV deployment,
Yeah.
It really is the role of the federal government to make investments that benefit the entire country, particularly in this global competitiveness, national security, supply chain security, and building up our trade partnerships outside of China so that we can really own the future of our advanced technology deployment in our transportation sector. It's a really, really important thing that this is what the federal government is supposed to do, because you're talking about a demand signal for products that may be in any of the 50 states, but that is pulling investment into, Tennessee and Georgia and South Carolina. Asking another state to do that, it may be something that comes into effect. My hope is that there are enough folks that do understand this. They really understand the importance of future U.S. global competitiveness. A lot of folks, they have a set of China talking points, but putting the data on an automotive sector and the battery sector in front of them as a basis for support of these policies, I think sometimes has a profound impact.
I mean, if your whole political personality is China, 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 this should be table stakes. if you want to compete against China, this is it. This is where they're dominating. These are the industries they're dominating. So, like, if you want to compete with them, you got to compete in these industries. It's just like,
that's right.
It's math.
That's right. This isn't the 30D credit. Isn't Joe Biden's credit. It's Joe Manchin's credit, and that's his whole deal.
Oh, I hate giving that man credit for anything.
You got to give him credit for the IRA.
Do I?
Yeah,
that's a different pod. All right. Well, this has been fascinating. It's always difficult to talk about these things when in the surreal environment we're in. But I think anyone who listens to this pod will have to acknowledge that, like, sense is on the side of these credits. Like, policy logic is on the side of these credits. Even raw political self-interest of Republicans legislates in favor of these credits. So, like, if we are in anything like a sane world, I think we should probably be pretty confident that the credits will survive. Is that fair? I'm scared to say that out loud, but
I hope so. And in some form. I mean, I think no politician, has a long career when they're voting against huge factories in their district. And, more to the point, when you get outside the sort of national political coverage and go talk to folks in their district, like, a lot of them are from the district. They care a lot about it. They were business owners, or they were state legislators. I mean, they care a lot about what's happening in the district. And a lot of these places have felt kind of disconnected from the rise of EV deployment over the last decade, but they're coming around to the view that they have a big stake in it because they're making the things. Yeah. They're producing or refining the minerals, or making the battery components.
Just a question of whether even self-interest now can overcome the immense weight and ubiquity of national politics. Everybody's always lamenting politics has gotten so nationalized that it's like some of these people on the ground level seem to care more about, like, what Target puts on its displays than they do about the economic health of their own district. At least some of those voters. I mean, they're probably overrepresented in media, so you know what I mean. So we'll see whether self-interest still.
Never bet against self-interest.
Oh, well, all right. Well, that's a good note to leave us on, and we'll see whether self-interest can triumph in the end.
But it's the interest of the community too. I don't want to be so cynical, but yeah, I think I didn't mean to step on your outro there.
No worries. All right, Albert Gore, thank you for coming. Thanks for walking us through this, and good luck talking to these folks.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you for listening to Volts. It takes a village to make this podcast work. Shout out especially to my super producer, Kyle McDonald, who makes me and my guests sound smart every week. And it is all supported entirely by listeners like you. So if you value conversations like this, please consider joining our community of paid subscribers at volts.wtf, or leaving a nice review, or telling a friend about Volts, or all three. Thanks so much, and I'll see you next time.